Hello and welcome to Independent Thinking from Chatham House. I'm Chris Sabatini, sitting in for Bronwyn Maddox, who's at the Delphi Economic Forum in Greece. In just 2 decades, China has gone from a minor player in Latin America and the Caribbean to a dominant force in the region, becoming the number one trade partner with countries such as Brazil, Argentina, Chile, and Peru, and some believing that it will overtake the U.S. as the top trading partner of the region overall by 2035. What does Beijing want in the region? And crucially, how is the U.S. responding under President Trump? Will his policies push China back or actually give it more space to expand? This week, we're going to start by looking at the how and the why of China's deepening its political ties with the region, and if there's a potential vacuum left by President Trump's cuts to development programs like USAID and others. We'll then look at the flow of money into and out of the region, including China's first billion-dollar mega port in Peru, the Chancay port, and why the region was let off relatively lightly in the latest round of U.S. tariffs. And finally, we'll discuss security and President Trump's repeated claim that the U.S. will retake the Panama Canal, and why Argentinian authorities demanded recently to inspect a Chinese space station built on their soil. To discuss all this, I'm joined with China expert Yu Jie and U.S. Latin America relations expert Bruno Binetti, both from Chatham House. We're also joined by Evan Ellis, who's Senior Associate at the U.S. Army War College. Welcome to all of you. So let's start by looking at what China's been doing over the last decade politically in South America and the Caribbean and Central America. Yu Jie, you've seen a number of countries in South America break relations with Taiwan in favor of Beijing due to economic and political inducements. I know it's not an easy task, but maybe you could explain briefly what their strategy was on this.
Well, the strategy is very simple. I think there are 2 ways in here. One is using China's large economic resources to try to extend the political influence, and most notably by offering various development projects. That's what Latin America as a region as a whole absolutely needed. That's one thing. Now, secondly, also having this some kind of political inducement that hoping to be able to work together with Latin American countries with organizations like United Nations, and that was much hoping to get China's preferences on global governance and insert it within UN agencies and collaborate together with some members of Latin American countries. And obviously, by also having more and more smaller-sized countries and showing allegiance to Beijing and give up Taiwan, and that will be measured as being part of the international relations success for China by reducing limiting the space of Taiwan to be able to operate internationally.
Evan, you've tracked this very closely and sort of been following, if you will, the columns in both cases. Have these changes come with political inducements, but also have they come with strings attached? And give us a sense of some of the countries that have, if you will, flipped in the last 10 years.
Absolutely, Chris. You have really 2 phases. You had the one phase which was prior to the 2007 to 2016 informal diplomatic truce between the PRC and the Kuomintang, the KMT. And so the last country that had flipped was Costa Rica in 2007 with Oscar Arias. And then after the return of the DPP, I should say a less PRC-friendly coalition in Taiwan in 2016, you had the beginnings of a series of flips, new competition that begun in Africa with Gambia and Sao Tome and Principe, but then extended to Latin America, first with Panama with the Varela government there, which is really the big prize for China post-flip. But then extended to El Salvador and to the Dominican Republic in that first wave before you had a heavy diplomatic and other pushback by the first Trump administration. Then you had what I would call a second wave with the more recent flips of Nicaragua and Honduras. But in each of those cases, what you saw was a series of quick activities. First of all, a trip by the new leadership, usually accompanied by politically well-connected business people who got special deals for their particular export sectors, whether it was special deals on coffee or fruit or other exports that benefited them personally, and then typically a series of non-transparent MOUs which opened up the sectors involved to Chinese companies, typically the energy sector, the telecom sector, usually associated with the establishment within a short period of time of a Confucius Institute, new training programs. Most recently, we see with Nicaragua and in Honduras, bringing over a large number of people from the media of those countries. And so what you see is certain benefits that go to those connected with the leadership, certain things that open up the market, oftentimes including a free trade agreement, which allows that penetration, and a series of other things which facilitates Chinese access in terms of government programs and Confucius Institutes and things like that.
Let's take it there. Bruno, you've studied this. You've looked at the economic contracts that are negotiated between Beijing and Ecuador, Brazil, and Argentina. Does ideology matter in all of this, or is it pragmatic? And what are those contracts? You've taken a deep dive.
Yeah, I would say there are structural forces at play here as well. In many cases, countries still recognizing Taiwan in the region are a legacy of the Cold War, when most of these countries had anti-communist regimes. The United States itself switched diplomatic recognition to Beijing in the late 1970s. And most of these countries' relationships with Taiwan are also quite transactional. Taiwan offers inducements to maintain these countries on their side. The problem was, in the decades since, China has become much more important economically than Taiwan, so now the inducements from Beijing are probably more appealing than those coming from Taipei. And that also explains a lot of what's going on. And I would say for most of these countries, and most countries in Latin America more broadly, the relationship with China is a very pragmatic decision to diversify their foreign policies, to diversify their economic engagements, and also to turn to a country such as China that has a lot of demand for what most Latin American countries have to sell. So I think, ideology is certainly there in some cases, but we see, Nayib Bukele in El Salvador can be accused of being a communist, and he's pursuing very close ties to China. So I think, in that sense, ideology and interest are pretty much entangled when it comes to this decision.
You even have Javier Milei, the libertarian president of Argentina, originally very aggressive in his rhetoric against China, then realizing as Argentina's number one export market for the goods, having to pull back. Let me ask a question to all three of you very quickly before we move on to the next subject, which is we've heard Donald Trump talk about resurrecting the Monroe Doctrine, the 1823 doctrine that basically declared Latin America as a sphere of influence. At the time, it was against Russia and Europe, and then later it was the Soviet Union. Now it's China. How do you think that's playing in Latin America? Let me start with you, Bruno.
So for me, the Monroe Doctrine, as this principle you're describing, never quite went away from the Latin American perspective. What we did see in the last few decades is a sort of benign neglect from Washington. And now we're seeing a revival of the most, let's say, aggressive version of the Monroe Doctrine from the Trump administration in particular, more with coercive measures, right? Threats, tariffs, pressure. We're seeing this in Panama, etc. What's missing, I think, if the United States want to maintain its influence in its so-called backyard, or front yard, as President Biden used to say, it needs positive inducements as well. And I think that's what's missing right now from U.S. strategy in Latin America. Coercion, can reap benefits in the short term, but I think in the longer term, that's what's missing from U.S. strategy.
What Beijing offered is this sense of positive inducement of development infrastructure, and to be able to purchasing more agricultural products from Latin America, which essentially is what China needed in the past few years to diversify its agricultural imports away from the United States and into somewhere else. So Latin America, obviously, I think it more comes as more a mercantilist actor for Beijing and less so a strategic actor. What I mean by mercantilist actor in here is, on the one hand, yes, this would enable the Chinese companies to be able to open up a new market, establishing their infrastructures, to be able to selling their renewable equipments and so many other export into Latin America. But then, on the other hand, it's also treating as a core source of energy supply to generate Beijing's economic growth as well. So it's mostly a mercantilist sphere of influence and less so at a strategic element, I would say.
Evan, your thoughts? Is there a risk here, perhaps, of an own goal, to use a soccer or football, as we call it here, metaphor?
There's lots of risks, Chris, and I think it's useful then and now to talk about how the Monroe Doctrine was presented versus how it was perceived. And even then, it's useful to remind ourselves that in 1823, when the doctrine was put out there, there was a sense that the United States, just having fought itself to a standstill against its previous, colonial oppressor, Great Britain, was rallying in solidarity with the countries in Latin America against what was seen as European meddling, which ironically included Russia at the time. But also, of course, a Monroe Doctrine came to be perceived, especially toward the end of the 19th century, as U.S. bullying and interventionism. Now, I think today, what is absent, once again, especially with the current administration, is the sense of standing in solidarity with the Americas and not just the bullying part. Latin Americans are looking to China in pragmatic terms. They understand that there are risks. They hope to get the benefits and to manage the risks. And with Chinese lawfare and other things, that's always an ongoing challenge. But I think what you see now is that with the decrease in U.S. programs, whether it's USAID or State Department programs, or the perceived focus on America's first through the tariff policies, which virtually across the board has impacted the region through at least the 10% baseline tariff, even countries in Central America, et cetera, that were originally being courted to produce, and thus see the U.S. market is more attractive than the Chinese market. Some of the perception of benefit, the risks, is that those are going away of working with the U.S. And if there's the sense that the United States is trying to be transactional too, in other words, if China's offering things, but the United States is moving away from the strengths that it traditionally had that were connected as a region, they really are the democratic good guys. Then when the United States comes really without a strong offer to the table, but says, hey, will you do this as a favor for the relationship to us? The danger of moving to a transactionalism without perceived benefits is that Latin America, faced with a PRC offer, even though knowing that it's a dangerous offer, says, well, why should we do the U.S. a favor and not go with a Huawei telecom system when the U.S. isn't offering anything better?
So basically, we've seen just diplomatically a strong play by China to flip some countries. This is an issue of economic interest, pragmatic, but it comes with potential risks. And those are augmented in the case of the United States now cutting back on development programs and not having a strong offer. Let's move to economics now. You've probably heard enough about people attempting to psychoanalyze Donald Trump and play, if you will, armchair psychiatrists with his tariff policy and what he wants to get out of it. But of course, Latin America was, despite having free trade agreements throughout the hemisphere with the United States, Central America and the Dominican Republic, Peru, Colombia, Chile, Panama, he's imposed 10% tariffs. So they've gotten off relatively lightly, but probably in a context of free trade agreements, not what was expected. Evan, do you think there's a longer-term strategy here of an intent to, if you will, sort of lock in critical minerals in Latin America by China? Or take the case of the Chancay port in Peru that I mentioned to try to sort of build dual-use infrastructure that could be used by China in the eventual possibility of a conflict?
Chris, for me, China's policies toward Latin America, and really over the past 20 years consistently, is part of its global engagement of trying to secure access to the minerals and other things that it needs for its own survival and the needs of the people, as well as the markets, particularly markets in high-value leading sectors, while at the same time also in political engagement and military engagement trying to create a world, so to speak, that's safe for the continuing rise of China and to be prepared and have options if it ever has to fight a war with the United States over an issue such as Taiwan. So for me, when I look at that, certainly in the economic sphere, access to traditional materials such as iron and copper, which it gets through contracts and significant investments in places like Peru and Chile, are significant, but absolutely right, understanding that much of the critical minerals, for example, lithium is available outside of Xinjiang, principally in places in Bolivia, parts of the north of Chile and the Atacama Desert, parts of the north of Argentina. And it has really done a lot to lead with investments there and lock up supply chains, although not without problems. But it's also things like the agricultural sector, companies like Nadera and Noble that also work with companies like COFCO, China Oilseeds and Foodstuffs Corporation, to be able to pull that over. And it's also in sectors, again, advanced sectors such as the digital Huawei, not only in 3G, 4G, 4G LTE, now 5G, but also things like cloud services. You have a number of different surveillance system companies like Hikvision. You have sectors, of course, like the electric vehicle sector and supporting infrastructure, where BYD is making tremendous advances in the region, et cetera. And of course, you have electricity infrastructure, including electricity transmission, but also green energy, a number of different wind and solar projects, companies like China Power, that has been making significant advances. And so to me, you have all of these things where where China has made these economic advances. And oh, by the way, trying to capture as much of the value added for itself through vertical and horizontal integration, cooperating with its government, but also among companies, whether it's in the telecom sector with component suppliers, but also in areas like ports.
Bruno, can you game out a little bit maybe what you think the effects of the 10% tariffs will be for China's role in the hemisphere in terms of the disruption of supply chains? Are there potential markets that China will be able to, and I don't mean this in a negative way, exploit or take advantage of because of the U.S. tariff policies?
So I would say we have to divide it between direct impacts and indirect impacts. Directly, of course, a 10% might not seem that much, all things considered, but a lot of the exports of Latin American countries towards the United States have very narrow profit margins, right, like commodities. So that is a major problem. That, of course, might mean that some Latin American countries are looking elsewhere, such as China, such as Europe as well. We have the ongoing discussions between the European Union and Mercosur, for instance, for a trade agreement. Now, indirectly, I think it's where Trump's uprooting of the global trade system will have the most impact in Latin America. Because Latin American countries, by definition, are very vulnerable to external shocks. So that means oscillations in the prices of commodities, which we're already seeing, financial turbulences, which we're already seeing. A lot of currencies in Latin America are under pressure because capital, in moments of crisis, seeks safe assets. And let's face it, those usually aren't in Latin America. And this is not, of course, with the case of Mexico, that is particularly affected directly by this. But paradoxically, Mexico seems to be doing a good job at managing Trump at the moment.
Jie, you've written about the power and potential of China's offer, not just in Latin America with a renowned co-author, foreign policy. That was me, by the way. But also in other regions. Give me a sense of, as China looks forward, how is it viewing its offer in terms of development for the potential of the countries, not even in terms of what China may gain out of it, but in terms of its own sort of economic advantages and the advantages to the host country?
The offer that China come up with, obviously, is the basic infrastructures that many of the Latin American countries that would need in order to building the economy. Like, for example, the most simple thing, the road, the port, the railway. So many of those basic stuff that China is able to offer, and China is able to offer to build up quite cheaply and quickly. And I think that's the advantage for that. But what has been really quite unclear for now is, firstly, how this contract has been discussed, and secondly, and what are the terms and conditions for now. And it seems to be rather unclear, and especially when you're dealing with the state entity, because for most of the cases, those state entities carry important political missions that follow by the guidance from Beijing. So that is one layer. Now, I think the second element in here, what we can say, is also that China, by being self-interested, but having Latin America being one of the areas that China is able to extracting natural resources in order to generating its own economic growth. And that is not a very key important element in here, because obviously most of the countries that has close relationship with China, for example, Argentina, Peru, and Colombia as well. And all these countries are essentially being part of the core supply for China's critical minerals as well at the same time. So I think it's both for diplomatic reasons that China engaged with Latin America, but I think most importantly, it's also a self-centered engagement that China wanted to do.
You mentioned Colombia, and I want to mention, of course, during the controversial deportation flights that President Petro of Colombia sent back midair, Trump threatened tariffs, 25% tariffs, if they didn't accept the deportees. And China came forward and said, well, we'll always be a friend. How effective do you think, for all of you, how effective do you think that is? Was this, again, a mistake by Trump to aggressively sort of bully Colombia into accepting? Or is this simply, sort of diplomatic gamemanship?
I think largely, we don't know what exactly Trump would have in his mind. But for China, it has been quite consistent in terms of engaging with developing world, with engaging with Global South. That is to say, to treat Global South as equal. If you see the diplomatic reception that Latin American countries' leaders, when they visit Beijing, they would receive. And also, for example, how many times that Xi Jinping himself, ever since he came to power, visited Latin America. So he visited Latin America 3 times, and more. And the countries he have been to is more than any 3 U.S. presidents or added together. And that is not even in China's backyard. So I think really at diplomatic level, Beijing has offered that sense of consistency and fair treatment towards his counterpart. And that is something well received at the other end.
Evan, your thoughts on this?
Yeah. Absolutely. China right now is quietly but consistently trying to position itself as the reliable, non-bullying free trade actor, which, given its behavior in places like the South China Sea and with Taiwan and Hong Kong, is very, very ironic. But having said that, there are both political and economic impacts of what President Trump has done. In political terms, obviously, there's the sense of driving countries that would have otherwise cooperated with the United States to a certain degree in resisting China to say, well, why should we not do so? But economically, there are a series of what I would call perverse, unanticipated consequences. So, for example, as we saw in 2018, 2019, during that previous round of President Trump's tariffs against China, the trade war with China, and we're now talking about 104% U.S. tariffs against China, perversely drives China to import more agricultural products and other things like strategic minerals from Latin America. Some of the biggest beneficiaries of that trade is, Brazil and Argentina, also Uruguay, and putting more pressure on a flip by Paraguay. But beyond that, also ironically, even though there's a lot of pressure on the Sheinbaum government in Mexico to not allow China to operate as a pass-through into the United States through USMCA, when tariffs against Chinese goods entering the United States, Shein, Temu, etc., are 104%, but Mexico has gotten special dispensation, and you can, if you can set up a minor manufacturing transformation operation of Chinese goods in Mexico and then bring them in through Nuevo Leon for, effectively, 0 or at least, 10 to 20% tariffs depending on the product. Again, you actually increase incentives for Chinese engagement in Mexico. And then, of course, as we talked about, really the rest of the region accelerating their inducements to diversify in a number of different ways. As you mentioned, it pushes them towards Europe. It pushes them more towards other actors, Japan, Korea, which have already been there, but it also pushes them, at least in part, towards China.
Thank you. I'd like to move now to the various security posturing and military maneuverings by both of these two superpowers, and to what degree countries in Latin America can leverage this competition for their own benefit. We hear a lot of people talking about strategic autonomy, which has become kind of the buzz phrase in some cases. Let's start with you, Evan. Trump made a series of unsubstantiated claims about China and its military presence in Panama, including, first of all, that there were Chinese troops guarding the Panama Canal, and that C.K. Hutchison, the Hong Kong-owned companies on either side of the canal, on the Pacific and Atlantic side, were a threat to U.S. interests, both in terms of its economic cooperation and potential for security gathering, but also for potential use in let's say, for naval refueling in the event of a conflict. What's your sense of that claim? And now we're seeing, and its impact on U.S.-Panamanian relation.
Well, Chris, as you know, Secretary of Defense Hegseth just is down in Panama this week. But for me, it's important to emphasize that while some of the details of the rhetoric are not precise, there are issues. And specifically, if you look at our U.S. Southern Command and U.S. Northern Command, which have responsibility for the warfighting that would occur, in their areas of responsibility if we ever went to war over something like Taiwan, for example, they have to look at what might geographically our Chinese competent adversaries do. And so when you look at the map, number one, you realize that a number of the sustainment and deployment flows would go out of, for example, U.S. East Coast ports, places like Savannah and Norfolk would flow through the Caribbean, would have to go through the Panama Canal, and what would be a race against time with heavy equipment and supplies to reinforce Taiwan against an invasion. So when you look at that, the map itself creates certain imperatives that the Chinese substantial non-transparent presence in commercial terms in Hutchison's ports in places like Mexico and places like Veracruz, some of the operations throughout the Caribbean, including the listening station in Cuba, and including commercial facilities like CM Port's presence in Kingston, Jamaica, for example, create opportunities for the Chinese under the cover of civilian operations to observe and interrupt some of those flows, especially going through the Caribbean. And the issue with the Panama Canal is not Chinese troops per se, but it's kind of like defending against terrorism. When you have the combination of physical access and technical knowledge and relationships, that gives you lots of different ways to shut down the canal, whether it's against the locks or the water management systems or the electronic control system or mining the canal or sinking a barge in the Calabar Cut or other things. And so the combination of Hutchison's presence and Costco's presence and others create that risk.
Your thoughts on this?
It's quite interesting. I mean, I would not necessarily consider it as being a security question because overall, as I said earlier, China more come across as a mercantilist actor within the region rather than a security one. But what really put Beijing not at ease on this one is suddenly any deals that they made with previous Latin American governments, for example, the case of Panama, that was made with the previous government, and then suddenly could be overturned. And this also makes China questioning the long-term investability of the region as a whole and how much this geopolitical wind actually this storm China will have to weather through, firstly. Now, secondly, I think when it comes to the particular case of Panama Canal, is also very tricky because if you carefully look into the shareholding structure of that particular project, it is not just the Siki Hutchison, BlackRock, but also the Chinese State Sovereign Wealth Fund also got involved as well as being part of the minor shareholder. Now, how are you going to play that with the minor shareholder structure? And does this actually apply to the rules of U.S. Security and Exchange Commission? I mean, so that really put a question of what is the role of U.S. regulator if United States want to come across as being a credible investing destination and entity?
Could it have a chilling effect on Chinese investment in other areas? In the Peru case in Shanghai port, there's already some element of reaction against it and even talk among some Congress people of applying tariffs for anything that passes through the Shanghai port. Probably will not come to fruition. But do you think this could have an effect on disincentivizing China to invest?
Certainly. I think for the Chinese investors, I mean, whether it's state investors or private investors, they are as shrewd as anyone else in the world. And they generally will have to look into the return on investment on any particular project. They will generally have to look into the financial guarantee, but also the state underwriting as well. So if that might be the case with the Port of Panama, and then that would equally apply, for example, perhaps Shanghai Port might be overturned and changing the shareholding structure as well. So anything could possibly happen. And I think this actually will constrain China and make China think twice whether they would continue to play only as being a mercantilist actor in this region.
Bruno, I want to ask you, how do you think that will play in Latin America? If suddenly a lot of this Chinese investment starts to dry up and they get a sense that the U.S. doesn't have anything to counteroffer, in this case BlackRock, may or may not, we'll see what happens with the Chinese government's now review of that sale. How do you think this will play in Latin America?
So I wanted to make 2 points about this. The first one is, I think sometimes it's clear that Beijing has a lot of leverage over state-owned companies, and there's plenty of evidence. But I think it would be a mistake to assume that every Chinese corporation operating in the world is directly controlled and answering to the Chinese government. I mean, they are state-owned, but they pursue very much profit-oriented goals. And in the case of Hutchison, you've seen this. When they announced the sale to BlackRock, the Chinese government publicly issued a communique rejecting that and saying that the company was making a mistake. If this was just a branch of the Chinese government, then there would have been no need for a public confrontation, right? And second, a lot of these projects that Chinese companies have built, including Shanghai, have been powered and demanded by the local governments themselves. So given that U.S. firms are not willing to handle the risk of building large-scale infrastructure in Latin America, and the Chinese companies are, but then the U.S. might ask, okay, now give it back, then that's a problem for Latin America as well, because who is going to build these sort of large-scale projects if the United States is only interested in coercion but doesn't offer incentives, and if the Chinese don't do it anymore?
Speaking of Chinese investments, you're Argentine. The Argentine government under Milei recently inspected the China space station. What went on there? What did they find?
So this has been going on since at least 2014 under President Cristina Kirchner when that base was built. Basically, China asked or demanded for that in exchange for some infrastructure financing. There's a lot of opacity around this space base. The Chinese Space Agency is part of the Chinese army. That certainly doesn't help. And this is a 50-year agreement in which Argentine authorities are virtually not allowed to enter without asking for permission first from the Chinese operating this space base. So that's certainly a problem. That said, I think if the U.S. intelligence community had found evidence that this was being used for military purposes, then this would have escalated years ago. There had been an inspection under President Milei. There was an inspection under former President Macri, a relatively pro-U.S. president. And there was, under President Macri, an addendum to the agreement installing the base that said that it would only be used for civilian purposes. Now, I'm not assuming that the Chinese signed that and intend to abide by it, but I think if there was really evidence of something fishy going on, we would have heard by now. But certainly there's a lot of opacity, and that contributes to U.S. suspicions.
Yeah. Evan, very quickly, yes, you have one comment, and I want, if you can, just elaborate too, just a little bit about you've studied very carefully over years now, military sales and security cooperation. So give a quick reflection and review on that before we wrap up.
First of all, to note that the Chinese, because of the pushback with the Trump administration, have paused their investment in certain places. You see that in Mexico and places like Nuevo León, but in other places like Brazil, they're proceeding forward. Also, the point about Hutchison was important because it shows the diversity of different types of Chinese companies. But we also see that even with quasi-independent companies like those of Li Ka-shing with Hutchison, the Chinese continues to have ways of adopting leverage and hurting one. For example, the antitrust investigation that was threatened. Also to note on the space base, and as was pointed out, this is something that the Macri government tried to get out of the contract and couldn't. The Milei government tried to get out of the contract and couldn't. But there's a broader risk which goes back to not just Argentina, but places like Chile with Venturones, places elsewhere in Argentina like the observatory in San Juan, access to other facilities such as the ones that the Chinese have built for Bolivia and Venezuela. That in time of war, the ability to use access to Western Hemisphere space to be able to locate and potentially later blind U.S. satellites, and also to communicate with things like a Chinese fractional orbital bombardment system, which would come over the South Pole, trying to do a strategic attack on the United States. Not presuming that these are strictly for military purposes, but when you are, Admiral Halsey at U.S. Southern Command, and you look at ways in which the Chinese could exploit access to space in ways that you have to consider for your warfighting mission, it does create strategic imperatives.
Thank you very much. Again, I think we're coming upon a consensus here, which is, in this case, too, China's investors differ. Their intentions sometimes differ. The extent to which they have ties to the Chinese government is varied and can have an impact. But also, as Evan, you're saying, in some of these cases, these could be assets that could be used in the event of a conflict. But there are also things that have certainly an economic purpose and a diplomatic purpose that we need to understand them very carefully. Thanks for listening, and please join us next time as we continue to look into the big ideas shaping international relations. Please leave us a review. We always enjoy reading them, especially the good ones. Our producer this week was Amanda Nunn. I'm Chris Sabatini. Bronwyn will be back next week, but I hope to see you all soon. Thank you.